Hello, and welcome to Third Thursday at Hoover's. I'm Jerry Flegel, President and CEO here at the Hoover Presidential Foundation, and thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight, we have one of your favorite presenters with us, Peter Hanley from the Hoover National Historic Site. But before we begin, I'd like to remind you of a few upcoming programs for you to share with your friends and family. The Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum is opening a new special limited time exhibit in the Corton Gallery next Saturday, January 28th. It's called 1968, A Folsom Redemption. It features details on the performances Johnny Cash made at the prison from photos and stories by two journalists who were there to cover it. It also details Hoover's plans for prison reform. The exhibit is only open through March 19th, so don't wait too long to see it. We have two other programs I'd like to tell you about. The first is our Uncommon Public Service Award program, which was created to honor our Iowa state legislators who go for uncommon service, who go above and beyond their legislative duties. And we're asking for your help in nominating an Iowa state representative or a senator who exemplifies Herbert Hoover's ideals of honesty, integrity, and uncommon public service. But we need to have you do it soon. Nominations close on March 1st, and you can do this easily on our website, hooverpresidentialfoundation.org, where you'll find the link under the Grants and Tabs Award. Also due in March on the 15th are applications for the Uncommon Student Award Program. It's for high school juniors only, and to apply, they need to enter an idea for a community service or entrepreneurial project of their own design and simply tell us of their plans. The selection committee will select 15 of these students in May, who will then spend the summer working their projects and reporting the progress back to a panel of judges in October. Each of the 15 will earn a $1,500 award, and 4 will earn a $10,000 scholarship. To apply, visit uncommonstudent.org, but don't wait until the last minute. They need to put some thought into it and collect a couple references as well. Please tell your school, library, or family about this program. You'd be amazed at the projects these students develop and the leadership skills they obtain. Also on our website, you can learn about a major fundraising campaign for the renovation of the Hoover Presidential Library and Museum exhibit space. It's been 30 years since the last renovation, and we're excited to bring new technology and other updates into the museum. We have a special benefit for Iowa taxpayers who contribute to the Timeless Values Museum Renovation Campaign, where you can earn an Iowa state tax credit equal to 25% of your gift of any size, no matter how much the gift is. There's still funds available from the state, but they won't last forever, so I urge you to consider making your gift soon. As for tonight's program, I encourage you to enter any questions you have for our speakers in the Q&A link at the edge of your screen. You can even vote for someone else's questions if it's of interest to you, as questions with more votes tend to get asked first. As I mentioned before, tonight's presenter is a local favorite, Dr. Peter Hanley, a ranger with the Hoover National Historic Site here in West Branch. I think this might be his 6th presentation on Third Thursday, and he probably now holds the record. And we have him back frequently because he just does excellent programs on that. So we're glad to welcome him back tonight and to talk about Iowa and the Great Depression. Peter, again, we're glad to have you with us again.
Thank you. Well, let's share a screen here. Iowa and the Great Depression. Now, Iowa is the home state of Herbert Hoover, of course. So it's a state that is associated with him as a child, and also a state that experiences one of the most tragic aspects of Mr. Hoover's career in a big way, and that is the Great Depression. Now, for many people, the Great Depression will become known as the worst hard time. It's a time when folks do without or make do to get by during difficult economic and social times. It's also a time in Iowa history when things get really interesting and kind of radical, and you actually have some active rebellion and farm protests going on. And finally, it's a time when you see a flowering of the arts, especially in the Regionalist School of Art, exemplified by Grant Wood. In the background of this first slide is Grant Wood's painting Stone City, which is a little town about 40 miles from West Branch. And it was the scene of Grant Wood's art colony in 1932 and 1933. Iowa in the 1920s. So Iowa in the 1920s is still going to be largely a rural state. And of course, much of what I'm going to be talking about in the Great Depression is going to be the effects of the economic downturn on farmers. It's also a period of time when Iowa cities are growing. We have a view here, I believe it's of Manchester, Iowa. The book, The Tattooed Countess, off to the left, is by an Iowa author named Carl Van Vechten, who went off to New York City and was part of the Harlem Renaissance, and who really exemplified the whole 1920s culture. That's why I included that slide. The novel is actually about Cedar Rapids, and it was very scandalous at the time. It was based on real people, and it was said that there was a copy of this book in the Cedar Rapids Public Library with all the names crossed out and the people it was based on penciled in. So if you want to know who was who, you could go and check out The Tattooed Countess from the Cedar Rapids Public Library. During the 1920s, Iowans were really of two minds. On the one hand, they bought the rhetoric that the farm was the best place to be, that rural life was really the true American life, as Thomas Jefferson had declared it 130 years before. But on the other hand, they could not ignore what was going on. Town life was getting better, and they are jealous. It's very hard to square this with the idea of the farm as being somehow superior. So farmers really have what we would call a crisis of confidence during this time, and they are really torn. On top of all of that, they're going through a depression before the rest of the country goes through a Great Depression, because the depression in Iowa really starts in World War I, or in the aftermath of World War I. During World War I, of course, under Food Administrator Herbert Hoover, there's a great expansion of farming, the idea being that we were feeding our people here at home and also feeding the allies overseas and our soldiers overseas. The war is going to start in 1914. The U.S. will get involved in 1917, and it will be clear that food provided by the United States is going to be crucial to winning the war. And in fact, you have the slogan, "Food will win the war," as you see on the poster there at the left. Farmers were encouraged to expand their production of crops into total production, pulling out all the stops. People just get caught up in this expansion mentality. They buy more land, they pull up fences, and they plant the whole field. They even plant in the ditches. It's a way of being patriotic and to be a little crass, to make a buck or two while you're doing that. The aftermath of the wartime expansion, though, will be dramatic. Banks will loan money for this expansion in land and crops. You know, they have the slogan, "Food will win the war." They also have a slogan, "Grow 2 blades of grass where one grew before." And one that I think is kind of funny, "Get an extra squirt from every cow." So in other words, all out production. And the government is going to encourage that production by providing price supports that guarantee a certain price for agricultural commodities. The problem is that in the early 1920s, that demand for food as well as the price supports go away. Countries in Europe get on their feet again faster than the United States originally supposed they would. They no longer need our grain. And there's a contraction of farm markets. Many small banks, which had loaned money and overextended themselves during the war, actually are going to fail in the early 1920s. In fact, more banks failed in Iowa in the early 1920s than failed in the Great Depression 10 years later. You could argue that all the bad banks have been weeded out by that time. Anyway, there's just a squeeze on farmers, and Iowa enters the Depression about 10 years early. There's no major effort by the government to help Iowa farmers during this time, although there's an attempt. There's something called the McNary-Hagen bill, which is co-sponsored by Gilbert N. Hagen, the man with the thatch of white hair in the photo at left, which is vetoed twice by President Coolidge. McNary-Hagen would have established a grain credit corporation in the United States, the government-owned corporation, which would have bought wheat, cotton, and corn, and then sell the surplus first on the domestic market, then on the world market. And since sales on the world stage would likely be at a loss, farmers would be assessed an equalization fee to make up the difference. This bill, though, is vetoed twice by President Coolidge, and of course not supported by Herbert Hoover. So now we get into the Great Depression itself. And of course, we all think of the Great Depression as starting in October of 1929 with the crash of the stock market. But the crash of the stock market for the nation, and especially for Iowa, is just a symbol. Really, the problems of overproduction, of overextended credit, and so forth that fuel the Great Depression are there months before, and the Depression will grow and grow during the early 1930s. As I said, Iowa was in a depressed state all through the 1920s, but things are about to get worse. Just when they thought it couldn't get worse, it did. The 1930s are going to be a period of drought, drastic weather conditions. It's going to be a period when crops are not going to be selling for very much, and farmers are going to face many challenges, as are Iowans in the small towns and cities as well. And this is going to lead to some rebellion, some militancy, if you will, starting right here in Cedar County, ironically, Herbert Hoover's home county, in 1931. The question that agricultural historians often ask is, why did Iowa farmers never get militant in hard times, as did the farmers in Kansas and Nebraska and the Dakotas and so forth on the Great Plains? And the simple answer is that Iowa farmers tended to grow many different crops rather than just relying on wheat or cattle and so on. So they've usually been able to survive fluctuations in the market, but that will not be the case during the Great Depression. And the first thing that is going to show their angst and upset is something called the Cow War, which, as I said, happens around Tipton, Iowa. And what the Cow War is not battles between cows, of course, but it results because of a program that the state of Iowa has mandated that all cows that produce milk for human consumption need to be tested for bovine tuberculosis, the idea being that the tuberculosis could be transferred to humans. And so this testing program actually goes on all during the 1920s and is not much of an issue until 1931. And specifically in Cedar and Muscatine County and a little bit in Henry County, where farmers openly try to prevent the vets from the state from coming onto their farms and testing cattle. And they will argue that the cattle tests are unreliable, that the tests actually make the cows susceptible to illness, and they'll also allege that the veterinarians are getting a kickback because when the cows are declared tubercular, they are sent to a packing house, and the farmer has to take a loss on that cow, a major loss. The state will give the farmer a third of their value. Another third is made up by the federal government, but the farmer just is out the third of their value. Farmers really think that this is an intrusion by the government. in their anxiety is fueled by a man named Norman Baker, who runs a cancer treatment facility in Muscatine. He had a cancer cure, which really wasn't real. It was all sort of make-believe, and he was taking advantage of people. And Norman Baker will go out on his radio station and also will travel the area, speaking with farmers and telling them to oppose the state and to rise up. There's really not much nice that you can say about Norman Baker, except he was a flashy dresser. He was known for always wearing lavender ties and white suits like Mark Twain. So anyway, the cow war will result with actual protests on several farms in the Tipton area. It'll get so bad that Governor Dan Turner will actually declare martial law in Cedar County and send out the National Guard. They will basically forcibly be doing the testing in the county. They actually will go to some of these farms at 3 and 4 in the morning to do the testing, kind of a surprise to the farmers. Eventually, the testing is completed, and the only casualty in the so-called cow war is one National Guardsman is evidently the victim of shooting himself in the foot. So that ends that part of the farm angst in the early Depression. Another thing that happens is the farm holiday movement. And this is going to be mainly in Western Iowa, led by the man you see pictured here, Milo Reno. There's a picture of Milo Reno seated there looking into the camera, another of him standing and speaking. The farm holiday movement had the theme that if bankers can take a holiday, so can the farmer. They believed that the way to combat the falling prices was to literally withhold their products from market, not to sell, and to drive up the price through artificial scarcity. And they will actually have blockades. And this is actually a photo of a blockade in Western Iowa. They're known for dumping milk and butter on the roads. And in one case, somebody is actually shot and killed. Their slogan is stay at home, buy nothing, and sell nothing. They will, like I said, hold these strikes in August of 32. At the same time, a communist organizer named Mother Bloor, whose real name is Ella Reeve Bloor, will come into Western Iowa and attempt to organize farmers in a radical way. Mother Bloor is arrested something like 36 times in her career as an agitator. So there's really a lot of fear going on. At one point, protesters actually are going to overrun the Iowa State Capitol and wielding pitchforks, just like in the movies. At one point in March of 1933, wielding pitchforks, farmers will enter the Capitol building. They're looking for the sponsor of a particular bill they didn't care for. The man was being threatened with being hung over the railing in the rotunda, but he escaped by hiding way upstairs inside the Capitol dome. Another time when this farm activism almost turned violent is the Judge Bradley incident, again in Plymouth County, which is Lamar's. That's the Plymouth County Courthouse on this slide. It's a picture of Judge Bradley at the left. The other gentleman at the bottom of your screen is Governor Clyde Herring. Anyway, Judge Bradley is 53 years of age at the time of this incident, which is April 27th, 1933. Group of farmers came into his courtroom protesting the foreclosures that Judge Bradley was signing. The Great Depression is going to be a time when about 1 in 7 Iowa farms is going to be foreclosed. Judge Bradley was actually a very conscientious judge, fairly honest man. He's going to not be too flustered by all of these men entering his courtroom. In fact, he'll actually tell them to stop smoking, tell them to take their hats off. And then finally, he says, please remove your hats in my courtroom. And allegedly also says, I don't have to listen to you farmers. Well, that's the match to the tinder. They rush the bench. They drag him off the bench. They drag him down the steps of the courthouse. They take him out into the country to a crossroads. Somebody procures a rope. They put a noose around his neck, throw the other end of the rope over a signpost, and actually pour grease on his head, and have him kneel in prayer and all these sorts of things, and supposedly actually hauled him up, pulled on the rope so that his feet almost left the ground. Through all of this, the judge was able to retain his composure. He had one thing they forced him to do was somebody had some bootleg whiskey, and so they thought it would be fun to force him to take a drink because the judge was a well-known teetotaler. It's fortunate he did take a drink because the poor man also had a heart condition. And the editor of the local paper was there, and he said, hey, you boys, stop it. That man's got a heart condition. If he dies, we're all going to be in serious trouble. And so they all leave him out there in the country. Somebody fortunately drives him back into town. The next day, Governor Herring will declare martial law in Plymouth County. And I want to point out, there is a little bit of a tie to Herbert Hoover, even in the Judge Bradley incident. The Hoover family, Hoover's grandmother and his aunts and uncles, actually lived near the town of Kingsley, which is in southeastern Plymouth County, Iowa. This is actually right around the hotbed for the farm holiday movement in Western Iowa. Well, the Judge Bradley incident is really going to turn the tide against the farmers at this point in time. And also what happens is the New Deal kicks in, and that takes care of a lot of the concerns the farmers have by bringing on some direct aid. And of course, Herbert Hoover is president during all of this and is roundly trounced. Blame it on Hoover, says the cartoon here, for being the cause of the Depression, and often criticized for not coming to the aid of the farmers or Iowans in general. Of course, as we all know, Hoover really was working very, very hard on behalf of the people, trying different programs during this time, trying pretty much anything except direct aid to help people. One comedian will actually make the comment, though, that if oh gee, now I can't remember the story, that if every Democrat in the state of Iowa were locked up in jail on election day, Hoover would still lose Iowa in a landslide. And indeed, he will lose Iowa in the election of 1932. Those of you who go to the Iowa State Fair are probably familiar with this picture, which is a staged train wreck that they did in August of 32 between two railroad cars, one marked Roosevelt, one marked Hoover. And that's an apt symbol of that very divisive election that is going to go to Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, FDR is going to carry Iowa by over 100,000 votes. He carries 93 of the Iowa counties, and Democrats will win 6 of 9 congressional seats. With Roosevelt coming in, the New Deal will start. And of course, Roosevelt selects an Iowan, a man named Henry Wallace, who is the editor of Wallace's Farmer, a farm paper founded by his grandfather, based in Des Moines. Wallace is a very quirky person, a little bit on the eccentric side, but definitely the leading voice for American agriculture in the 1920s and 1930s. There's a really classic biography of him called American Dreamer. In a lot of what you can say about Henry Wallace was he was a dreamer. He was interested in alternative religions. He was interested in science. He was interested in mysticism. There wasn't a topic that he didn't have some interest in or could not speak authoritatively about. One former vice president at Iowa State who knew Wallace would say that he was the most intelligent person he had ever met, and he could talk on any subject: foreign policy, economics, religion, anything you would bring up. He was very well read, and he had opinions about everything. Well, anyway, Henry Wallace will be the Secretary of Agriculture, who brings in the New Deal, and specifically who brings in the Agricultural Adjustment Act, otherwise known as the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which is founded by the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And the AAA is basically going to set up production controls, and it's going to cut back production on 7 major crop commodities: wheat, cotton, corn, hogs, rice, tobacco, and dairy products. It institutes direct payments to farmers for not producing, for limiting their production. And it's going to be the foundation of farm policy in the United States pretty much up to the present day. It was paid for by a processing tax leveled on food processors such as General Mills and so on. Unfortunately, the AAA goes into effect in late spring after the crops have been planted and the hogs have farrowed and produced little piglets. And so in a time when there's actual starvation in the country, people are treated to newsreels of farmers plowing up corn in drowning baby pigs. But as Wallace said, farmers can't run old folks' homes for hogs and keep them around indefinitely as barnyard pets. He had that kind of cool scientific mindset about things. Approximately 75% of Iowa farms will participate in the AAA. In 1936, it'll be ruled unconstitutional. They changed things around a little bit and bring it back in 38 as more of a land conservation program. But this is going to at least bring some money into the pocketbooks of Iowa farmers and will help them sustain themselves during the Depression. And I have a few facts and figures about the Depression at this time. Corn would go as low as 8.5 cents a bushel. In fact, it goes so low that some people will burn it for fuel rather than sell it. Hogs go for $3 or less per 100 pounds, and cattle as low as $1.50 per 100 pounds. Land values will go from a high of $254 in 1919 to $68 an acre in 1933. 1,200 Iowa banks will fail, and an unemployment in Iowa will approach 18%. Have to say a little bit more about Henry Wallace. Of course, he was also involved in another farm revolution, which was the introduction of hybrid corn. He was a scientist and plant breeder. He bred chickens and strawberries and hybridized seed corn, and founded a little company known as Pioneer Seed. In 1940, Roosevelt will select him as his vice presidential running mate, and Wallace will be vice president of the United States until 1945, misses becoming president by 83 days because he's dumped from the ticket in 44, and Harry Truman replaces him. Henry Wallace will go on to run for president himself in 1948 on the ticket of the Progressive Party and really not do very well, and he'll go into retirement. Always interested in his plant breeding and other projects. He will die in 1965. He's one of the very first people diagnosed with ALS. I think he was patient number 77. At that time, scientist that he was, he actually monitored his own condition and took notes on it because he wanted to be of service to doctors in treating that condition. In addition to the AAA, another program that will affect some rural people is a homestead project of the Resettlement Administration. And in Iowa, there is one resettlement project, which is called the Granger Homestead Project. And this comes about through the efforts of Father Luigi Lagudi, who you see in the photo at upper left there. He is a Catholic priest. He comes to the town of Granger in 1926. Granger sits in the middle of some Iowa coal fields. There's a lot of poverty there. Very, very early on in the New Deal, as soon as he hears about this program, Father Lagudi will apply for Granger to be the site of a homestead, New Deal subsistence homestead project, which will be funded by the NIRA Act. It's one of 100 of these communities, and it will be one of the most successful. It involved building 50 homesteads on 225 acres of land adjacent to the town of Granger. The original idea was that families would build their own homes, but the government decides that these are going to be built by contractors. There are 50 of the 50 homes built. 5 have 4 rooms, 33 have 5 rooms, and 12 are 6-room houses. They all have full basements, bathrooms, central air, in hot water. Eleanor Roosevelt will, of course, visit this project, as she visited so many places during the Great Depression as her husband's eyes and ears. And she will come there in 1936. Each of these homesteads was affordable at $3,500. And most of the homesteads were paid off by the early 1950s. In fact, no one of the 50 families defaulted on their loan. Sometimes they were a little late with payments, but everybody eventually was able to pay off the loan for these homesteads. So this is a success story. Father Lagudi will eventually become a Monsignor. He will go to Rome and will be an advisor to the Vatican on rural issues. In fact, several popes referred to him as their county agent. He died in 1983, and by request, his body was returned to Granger and buried with his congregation in that Iowa community. We're probably all familiar with another New Deal program called the Civilian Conservation Corps, also known as the CCC. This is started very early in the New Deal, and it will involve young men ages 18 to about 25 years of age to do work with trees and in parks. They will earn $30 a month. Of that, $25 is sent immediately home to their parents. They get to keep $5. And here we see some young men working on a bridge in one of the Iowa parks. They'll build shelters in Backbone State Park. They also do work in Ledges State Park and at Makokata Caves. I believe this bridge is in Backbone, but I'm not 100% sure of that. But anyway, a program that we still see evidence of around the state today when we go and enjoy Iowa State parks. The Rural Electric Association, or REA, will be another New Deal program. This will be one of the most popular programs of all. Of course, everybody criticizes, not everybody, but many people criticize Roosevelt's programs in the New Deal. Not least of whom of the critics was Herbert Hoover himself. But one program that everybody seems to get behind is the REA. This sets up rural electric cooperatives around the country in rural areas where farmers are able to band together and get electric lines out to their homes. It brings electricity to the home. It brings running water to the home. And just it is a sea change in life for these people. One woman will describe it as the fairy goddess of electricity waved her wand and changed my life. People will paint this date or write this date on the wall in the barn or in their kitchen so that they always remember the date that the lights came on. And one thing that comes with having electricity is radio. In Iowa has a strong radio tradition, many stations starting in the 1920s. Here are three of the key figures in Iowa radio in the 1920s and 1930s. Clockwise from top left is a man named Ronald Reagan. There's a name you don't hear too often. That's a bad joke. Reagan will work for WOC radio in Davenport and later with WHO radio as a sports broadcaster in the 1930s. The distinguished looking gentleman at right with the beard and glasses is B.J. Palmer, who's the head of the Palmer School of Chiropractic in Davenport, and he will have a popular station called WOC, which stands for Wonders of Chiropractic. And he is a very eccentric and interesting fellow, as you can tell by that flowing tie he's wearing. He has an attraction built around his station called Little Bit of Heaven, which has all sorts of Oriental and Egyptian artifacts on display. And finally, there's Henry Field, who you see seated at the desk in the lower left. And Henry Field will have a station down in Shenandoah, Iowa, that will basically support his seed company, the Henry Field Seed Company. By the way, he had founded that seed company when he was a teenager, which I always think is very interesting. So radio, electric lights, running water, all of this will come as part of the REA. Before I talk about, we'll talk about Harry Hopkins next, I guess. Harry Hopkins is going to be another Iowan that is going to come to prominence during the New Deal, during the Great Depression. In fact, you could tell the story of Iowa and the Great Depression largely as a series of biographies. There are going to be a number of people: Herbert Hoover, Henry Wallace, Harry Hopkins, John L. Lewis as a labor leader. These are all Iowa-born, Iowa natives, Iowa-educated people who are coincidentally, in a way, leaders during this time period. Harry Hopkins is going to be born in Sioux City. He attended Grinnell College. He always thought of Grinnell as his home. When he, many years after his death, his ashes were actually buried there in the cemetery. He's going to be a social worker, and he will come into the Roosevelt administration as an aide. And he will, among other things, head the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which is going to do a lot of projects similar to the CCC later on in the New Deal. Hopkins will later be groomed by FDR as a possible successor, but his health was very poor. He will move into the White House with the Roosevelts, live there for about 3 years with his family. And during that time, he becomes Roosevelt's closest friend and confidant, and will actually go on several missions to Great Britain and the Soviet Union very early on in the war. And you could argue that Harry Hopkins is probably the second most powerful man in the country in the war years. But in the 1930s, he was the powerful head of the WPA. And the WPA will sponsor several, you could say they're make work projects, but certainly they are projects that put Iowans to work and that leave a lasting and indelible impression on the state to this day. We probably all have seen a post office built by the WPA, or a swimming pool, or a high school, or a school addition. that was built under the Works Progress Administration. They'll build swimming pools, bridges, stadiums, dams, community buildings. There are buildings on the Iowa State Fairgrounds that are built by the WPA. And they do some work on the lock and dam system on the Mississippi River. Here we see a swimming pool at Jefferson, Iowa, built by the WPA project underway. And an important and lasting contribution of the WPA is the Iowa Guide. They do guides for all 50 states. The Iowa Guide comes out in 1938. It is the 4th state guide published. And it's really good. I use it, I have it in the car. It's a guidebook, but you go to Muscatine or Iowa City and or any of these small towns, and you can read about the history of that town even today, and sometimes look up some of the landmarks are still there that the guidebook tells you to keep an eye out for. And this guide was reprinted in 1988, and that's the picture at the bottom of your screen is of the new edition. Grant Wood will be the leading light in an explosion of art in the state in the 1930s. Of course, Grant Wood is an internationally known figure today. He's a regionalist painter. In the late 1920s, he will move from painting impressionist style landscapes to kind of an abstract realism, such as you see in the paintings here. There's a self-portrait of Grant Wood. There's his painting Fall Plowing with the plow in the foreground, and then also the painting Spring Turning. And of course, he's best known for American Gothic, and that painting is so well known, I thought it would be a little redundant to put it up here on the screen. But anyway, Grant Wood will found an art colony in 1932 at Stone City, as we mentioned earlier, about 40 miles from West Branch, and about 50 or so young people, young artists will train under him, and Marvin Cohn and Adrian Dornbush and several other noted Iowa artists at that time. And really, in some ways, when you think of Iowa and Iowa landscapes, you envision a Grant Wood painting. And when I think of the 1930s in Iowa, I envision the work of Grant Wood. So definitely, he's an important figure to come out of the Great Depression era. Here we see some pictures of his Stone City art colony. The brochure is from the art colony. The picture in the upper left is of some of the students. The picture on the right is of the teachers of the Stone City at Stone City. And then, of course, the painting is the painting Stone City that Grant Wood completed himself. Among the people who are part of Stone City that you may have heard of are Lee Allen, John Bloom, and Isabel Bloom, the sculptor. These are all people that studied with Grant Wood at that art colony. So one of the things we have to focus on is how people survived the Great Depression. And this could be really titled Making Do on the Farm or Making Do at Home during those hard times. One thing that you're going to see with the Great Depression early on is a push to get women out of the workforce. The idea being that women are taking jobs that men who should be providing for their family should hold. And so there's going to be a push to terminate the employment of many women early in the Depression. The ironic thing is that the employment of women in Iowa actually goes up some 20% because they simply need to work. They simply need to provide an income for their families at home. So there are women in the workforce, and then there are women working on the farm, doing important work. This is a very idealized mural of some of that work going on. Rural women are going to be noted especially for raising chickens. and Iowa will be a leading producer of chickens and eggs during these years. And it's an important source of income for farm families. Families in town and on the farm are just going to learn to make do. For farm families, it's a little bit easier because they learn to do without many of the things that people in the town have. And so they are able to produce their own food, so nobody starves and so forth. But even on the farm, they may not be able to get coal. So some turn to burning cow chips or corn for fuel. People wear flour sacks as clothing. One woman in Iowa years later will recall going to a local junkyard and ripping the fabric out of abandoned cars and using that for making clothing for her family. In small towns, banks and other businesses will go under. School boards are going to have to make do with a tighter and tighter budgets as the tax base shrinks. And there's a sense of desperation. The most desperate story that I encountered when reading and researching on the Great Depression was a man in the Grinnell area who, according to the story, I don't know, if it's actually true, dug up his young daughter's grave, moved her body to the backyard of the family home so that he could sell her cemetery plot and used the $5 he got for it to buy shoes for his surviving children. That's about as sad a story as you're ever going to find. Farm women also are involved in just out and out farming. Like I said, raising chickens, milking cows, running the tractor if need be, helping in the harvest. And I wanted to highlight here some pictures of some tenant farm families in Iowa living a little closer to the edge during the Great Depression. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the photographs of Pete Reddick, who is a farm agent in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, serving farm families and rural folks in that region. He was also an amateur photographer, and he took these enduring images of families on the farm, starting in the 1920s, all through the Great Depression and into the 1950s. And he will actually market these photos to farm magazines. He takes something like 50,000 images in his career. And these are all now part of the collection of the State Historical Society in Iowa City. Finally, something that comes out of the Great Depression and art, and is also associated a little bit with Grant Wood, are the post office murals. These are WPA and Treasury Department projects. If a federal building was being built during the 1930s, the law required that 1% of the cost be set aside for artwork. And that is why when you go into some of these buildings from the 1930s, you're going to see statues, bronze plaques, and lots of murals, especially in post offices. There'll be something like 40 post office built in Iowa during the Depression, and they'll all have a mural over the postmaster's door, like you see here. And my favorite is this crazy one, which is the Iowa Corn Parade, which is painted in 1931, and it's kind of got a circus theme to it and a giant ear of corn. Some of the murals are of daily life. This is of a fire. Family's been able to drag their piano out in the front lawn. This is a fire in Corydon, Iowa. In Corning, Iowa, a local man got the contract for doing the mural, and he will paint something called the band concert. I might mention Lee Allen, who some of you might be familiar with. He only died about 10 years ago, did several of these murals, as did John Bloom. In fact, here in Cedar County, in the Tipton Post Office, there's John Bloom mural. And then finally, perhaps the best known New Deal mural in Iowa is going to be in the library at Iowa State College, now Iowa State University. It's called When Tillage Begins, Other Arts Follow. The first part of this mural is by Grant Wood himself, and that is the plowing scene you see in the upper left corner. And the idea is it's based on a quote from Daniel Webster: when tillage begins, other arts follow. And the other arts are symbolized by the murals you see in the lower right. So in addition to obviously these farm veterinarian scenes and so forth, there also is some home economics in industrial manufacturing and so on. All the sorts of things that students would be learning at Iowa State are represented in these murals, and I'm only showing about a third of the mural here. And it was my distinct joy when I was a student at Iowa State to actually sit in the great rotunda of the library and enjoy these murals all to myself during many evenings when I would be studying. Also at Iowa State is the veterinary medicine mural. This is by Christian Peterson. If you've been on the Iowa State campus, he is the artist in residence at Iowa State for some 30 years and did a lot of artwork. The central figure in this mural is called the Gentle Doctor, and it is a veterinary doctor holding a puppy. And I apologize for the poor quality of this photograph. It's really quite a striking memorial. So people are going to remember the Great Depression in many different ways. It is still with us. Those of us who had parents and grandparents, or maybe ourselves, lived through those hard times, know that folks that survived the Great Depression years had their character indelibly stamped by those difficult times. And maybe you can think about habits that your grandparents had or parents, of making do, of not throwing things away, of saving things just in case. My grandfather, this is a story in our family. We took an old appliance out because we bought a new one, and he insisted that we keep it in the basement, the old appliance, because he said, you never know, you may come up against it someday and you'll wish you still had that thing. So we had this washing machine in our basement for years and years and years, just in case. Anyway, two people who wrote about their youth during the Great Depression are Mildred Armstrong Kalish, who I understand just passed away at, I believe, the age of 100. She wrote the book Little Heathens, Hard Times and High Spirits on an Iowa Farm During the Great Depression. It's a delightful series of stories about growing up on a farm near Garrison, Iowa, in Benton County. She also will live in Garrison during the winter months. Wonderful record of life during the Great Depression. And then the book We Have All Gone Away by Curtis Harnack. And Curtis Harnack was raised near Remsen in western Iowa. And so they both shed some light on those difficult years. So the Great Depression for Iowans and for the nation will finally come to an end with World War II. The New Deal didn't end it. Roosevelt's policies didn't end it. And certainly it endures. And you think of it for Iowans, there's a depression feeling extending back to 1920. So almost 20 years of hard times. And then they finally come out of it with World War II. And the men go off to war, the men and the women go off to war, I should say. There is increased production for the war years, and the worst hard time comes to an end for the so-called greatest generation. But it will leave an impact, and we see that impact not only in the habits of mind that endure among folks that experience the Great Depression and their children and grandchildren, but also in such things as post office murals and public swimming pools and park shelters that were built during those hard years when we were struggling to find our way as a nation and struggling to find and to keep body and soul together during a difficult time. Thank you.
Well, Peter, thank you very much. Great presentation as always on there. And we have a few questions. I think we've got about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to go ahead and just start firing away if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay,
Oh.
sounds good. So the first question's from Carolyn, and she goes, so the New Deal was a Hoover or was a Roosevelt program. In the end, how did Hoover feel about that and think about that?
Well, he once made the comment, the cost of the New Deal threatens to exceed the cost of the Great War. He hated it. He thought that Roosevelt was more or less a charlatan who was giving the people what they wanted, direct aid and so on, in not doing the substantive reforms that he believed would allow rugged individualism to survive in the country. So Hoover definitely not a fan of the New Deal. Certainly not a fan of a program like the AAA, which paid farmers not to produce.
Mm-hmm. But it's interesting you made the observation towards the end of your program presentation about that. In essence, really the Depression did not end until we got into World War II. So yeah. So anyway, Helen writes, during the pandemic, we saw masses of food sources destroyed because of lack of transportation. You spoke of the destruction of food because of low prices. Would you talk a little bit about the wasting of food when people go hungry as a way to solve farm crisis?
Well, the idea is to create artificial scarcity. And by destroying food, you have less to go to market, the prices go up. And that's what they were looking at. So they weren't really thinking in terms of feeding the hungry at that point. They were thinking in terms of keeping the farm. A lot of these people, you have to bear in mind, are faced with losing their livelihood. They're faced with farm foreclosure. 1 in 7 Iowa farms are going to be lost. Even the governor of Iowa lost his home during the Depression years. Governor Herring lost his home in Des Moines, was foreclosed on. So they're in desperation, and they're really having to look at that bottom line. And unfortunately, it didn't extend to thinking about folks that didn't have a meal.
Sure. Was there any particular segment that suffered more than others during the Depression?
Well, boy, I would say in Iowa, and you can tell because I focused on it almost exclusively, the farm population suffers the most. There are definitely people in groups on the edge, African Americans, widows, and such, that are going to have a harder time making it through the Great Depression. And this is where you get into the very, very difficult and almost painful stories of survival.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Russ writes, while the Depression did not end, it is fair to say the CCC and the WPA, with the payments for work, at least allowed people to survive to ease some of the desperate pain of the Depression on there. You got any thoughts on that?
Yes, definitely it did. It brought them money. And it's interesting. There's a museum, I think it's in Backbone State Park now, dedicated to the CCC in Iowa. That money made a difference for many families. And like I said, $25 a month going back to your mom and dad certainly maybe help keep the farm or the house and the family.
Mm-hmm. How did Iowa compare to other states as far as for suffrage during the Depression?
I think we had an advantage in that so many of our people lived on farms, so you don't see out and out starvation so much as you'll see in places like New York or out west in the Great Plains. Remember, this is also the period of the Dust Bowl. We didn't get into it too much. Iowa will have terrible droughts in 1934 and 1936, but we won't have Dust Bowl-like conditions like you have in Kansas and Oklahoma, where the people are just basically forced to put everything that they own into the car and head west. One thing I want to add, though, when we're talking about the Dust Bowl, is there were families that were able to stay there, and they were able to hang on. They were rooted in dust, if you will, but they were able to hang on and make it through the Depression because they were just very, very resourceful.
Okay.
So that's definitely an aspect of the country where you're going to see a lot of suffering, and in the cities as well, people sleeping on park benches and so forth.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, that's all the time we have for questions for now. And I'd like to thank our guest, Peter Hanley, for sharing the research findings and the history behind the Great Depression in Iowa. As a reminder, this program is being recorded and will be placed on our website archive for you to enjoy and share anytime. Remember, the Presidential Library is now open 7 days a week from 9 to 5, while the historic site is under winter hours and closes daily at 4:30. Please join us next month when Hoover Library Director Dr. Thomas Schwartz presents Lincoln and Hoover and highlights of these great presidents. Prior to coming to the Hoover Presidential Library, Dr. Schwartz was the director of the Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield, so he has vast knowledge of both men and some very interesting stories that you're going to want to hear about. Remember to visit the Folsom Redemption exhibit opening next Saturday, January 28th. This candid and personal photography exhibit covers a critical juncture in the career of Johnny Cash, one of the 20th century's most beloved performers. And I'd also encourage you again to nominate an Uncommon Iowa legislature by March 1st and help us recognize uncommon service above and beyond their legislative responsibilities. Use our online form at hooverpresidentialfoundation.org and look under the Grants and Awards tab for details. And also, if you know of any high school juniors out there who could lead a local service project, encourage them to apply for the Uncommon Student Award Program, where they could earn as much as $11,500 for college. The Hoover Presidential Foundation staff is ready to assist you with your membership needs or charitable gifts in support of the Hoover campus and museum renovation, and you can learn more about that and even show support at timelessvaluescampaign.org. Gifts to the campaign qualify for 25% Iowa State tax credit. And on behalf of all of us here at the Hoover campus and the participating public libraries, we thank you for joining us and look forward to your next visit to the Hoover campus. Good evening.